The day I lost the room. There is a moment I have never fully told anyone about. Not because it was catastrophic in the way that makes for good stories. No one died, no company collapsed, no marriage ended that night. It was worse than that in a way because it was quiet. It was the kind of failure that happens in front of people without anyone saying a word about it. I was 31 years old, sitting at a conference table in a building I had spent 2 years trying to get into. There were 7 people in that room. 3 of them had the power to change the entire trajectory of my career, and I knew it going in. I had prepared for weeks. I had the data. I had the slides. I had rehearsed the answers to every question I could imagine being asked. What I did not have, and would not understand until much later, was any real awareness of what was happening in that room while I was talking. I opened strong, or so I thought. I moved through the material with confidence. I was articulate. I was prepared. And somewhere around the 12-minute mark, I felt something shift. I could not name it then. I just felt it. The way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. The energy in the room had changed. Someone who had been leaning forward was now leaning back. Someone else had stopped taking notes. The man at the head of the table was still looking at me, but something behind his eyes had gone somewhere else entirely. I pushed through it. I told myself I was imagining things. I talked faster. I made my arguments more forcefully. I added detail where I should have asked a question. I filled silence where I should have let it breathe. By the time I finished, the room was polite in the way rooms are polite when they have already made a decision and are simply waiting for you to stop talking so they can leave gracefully. I walked out of that building knowing I had failed without understanding how or why. I had said everything right, and I had felt nothing that mattered. That was the day I began to understand that intelligence, the kind measured in test scores and academic records, and the sheer volume of facts a person can recall, was not what I had always believed it to be. Not the complete picture, not even close. Over the following months, I did something uncomfortable. I stopped asking what I should have said and started asking what I should have felt. I went back over that meeting in my mind, not to defend myself, but to observe, and what I found when I looked honestly was alarming. I had been so locked inside my own performance anxiety that I had missed everything. I had missed the shift in energy at minute 12. I had missed the moment when one of the decision-makers wanted to ask something and I talked right over the opening. I had missed the fact that the emotional temperature of the room was calling for connection, for curiosity, for genuine dialogue, and I had given it a presentation. I had been emotionally blind. And the worst part was that I had not known it. That is the nature of emotional blindness. It does not announce itself. It simply costs you things quietly over time until you look around and wonder why certain doors keep closing while other people walk through them without apparent effort. This is not a book about that meeting, but it is, in the deepest sense, a book written because of it. Because what I discovered in the years that followed, through deliberate study, through practice, through a great deal of failure with people who deserved better from me, is that the skills I lacked that day are learnable. Every single one of them. The ability to read what is happening in a room. The ability to regulate what is happening inside you. The ability to connect with people not through the performance of connection, but through its actual substance. These are skills. They have structure. They can be built. And the people who seem to possess them naturally, the ones who walk into rooms and immediately shift the energy, the ones who say the thing that lands exactly right, the ones who inspire loyalty without demanding it, most of them did not arrive that way. They developed it, sometimes consciously, sometimes through years of hard experience, sometimes both. But it is not magic and it is not personality. It is craft. Over the next several hours, I am going to give you that craft in the most direct and practical form I know how. We are going to move through the full architecture of emotional intelligence, from the foundational self-awareness that makes everything else possible, to the advanced calibration skills that allow you to read what people are feeling before they have words for it themselves. We are going to talk about influence and why the ethical version of it is more powerful than the manipulative kind. We are going to talk about difficult conversations, about leadership, about the psychological tactics people use to erode your confidence, and how to recognize and dismantle them. But more than any of that, we are going to talk about what it actually feels like to go from emotionally blind to emotionally fluent. Because that journey is not just professional, it touches everything. The way you show up for the people you love, the way you handle the moments when your own fear is loudest, the way you recover when life hits in ways you did not anticipate. I lost the room that day at 31, but the version of me sitting here now would not have lost it, not because he is smarter, but because he knows how to pay a different kind of attention. Let that be the promise this book makes to you. Not that you will become someone else, but that you will become someone who sees more, feels more accurately, and responds more wisely in every room, with every person, in every moment that matters. The invisible tax. Every skill you have ever neglected has a cost. Most of those costs are visible enough that you can trace them back to the source. You did not practice the presentation, so the presentation was rough. You did not do the preparation, so the meeting went sideways. The relationship between cause and effect is legible, and that legibility at least gives you somewhere to direct your effort. But emotional intelligence operates differently. When you lack it, the costs accumulate in ways that are almost impossible to audit in real time. They do not announce themselves. They simply show up as patterns that you cannot explain. The promotion that went to someone less qualified on paper, the relationship that cooled without a clear incident you can point to, the conversation that felt fine while it was happening, but left the other person with a completely different impression than the one you intended. This is what I call the invisible tax. It is what you pay every single day for operating without full emotional awareness. And the reason most people never address it is that they never fully see it. They just know that something is not working the way it should, and they keep trying to fix it with the tools they already have. More preparation, more effort, more information, while the actual problem sits untouched underneath all of that. Let me make the tax visible. There is research from the organizational psychologist Travis Bradberry that found approximately 90% of top performers across industries score high in emotional intelligence, while roughly 20% of low performers do the same. The correlation is striking, but what is more striking is what it implies about the gap between talent and outcomes. You almost certainly know people who are technically excellent at their work and somehow cannot seem to translate that excellence into the recognition, influence, or advancement that should logically follow. And you almost certainly know people who are not the most technically gifted in the room, yet seem to move through professional environments with a kind of effortless traction. The difference in most cases is not what they know, it is how they move through the emotional and relational dimensions of the environments they inhabit. The invisible tax shows up in your career in ways that are easy to rationalize away. You do not get the leadership role because the timing was not right, or because the other candidate had a specific technical qualification you lacked, or because the organization had internal politics you were not positioned to navigate. And all of those things may be partially true, but underneath them, often, is something simpler and harder to say out loud, that the person making the decision did not feel confident that you could handle the human complexity that leadership requires. Not because you were not smart enough or skilled enough, but because something in how you showed up, how you managed tense moments, how you responded to challenge or criticism left them uncertain about your emotional range. That uncertainty costs you, quietly, every time. In your relationships, the invisible tax runs even deeper. Human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to emotional attunement, the sense that another person is genuinely tracking your inner experience, not just your words. When that attunement is absent, people feel it. They may not be able to name it. They may tell themselves the relationship is fine, that there is nothing specifically wrong. But over time, they drift. They stop bringing the complicated things. They keep the conversation at the surface, where it is safer. And the relationship slowly hollows out while both people wonder vaguely why it no longer has the same weight it once did. The tax compounds over years in ways that do not show up in any single conversation or interaction. It shows up as a network that is wide but not deep, as a career that is competent but somehow stuck at a particular altitude, as relationships that function but do not nourish, as a reputation that is respectable but not magnetic, as a life that, from the outside, looks more or less like what you intended, but from the inside carries a persistent low hum of disconnection that you cannot quite locate or fix. Here is what I want you to understand about that hum. It is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that you were never taught a skill that matters enormously, a skill that is learnable, that has a clear structure, and that changes the quality of every single human interaction you have, once you begin to develop it. The research on emotional intelligence began to take its current shape in the early 1990s through the work of psychologists Peter Salovey and John Mayer, who were later joined in popularizing the concept by Daniel Goleman. What Goleman demonstrated most forcefully was something that cut against the dominant assumptions of that era about what made people successful. The idea that IQ, raw cognitive horsepower, the ability to process and retain information, was the primary driver of life outcomes was not just incomplete. For outcomes in domains that involved other human beings, it was almost beside the point. Goleman's analysis of competence data from organizations across industries found that emotional intelligence competencies accounted for significantly more of the variance in top performance than cognitive ability or technical expertise did, particularly in roles that involved leadership, influence, and relationship management. This was not a small effect. It was substantial enough to suggest that the way most people and most educational systems had been thinking about human capability was systematically missing something important. What followed was decades of research that refined and complicated the picture. Not everything written under the banner of emotional intelligence has held up to scrutiny, and some of the more extravagant claims made in the popular press deserve skepticism. But the core finding, that the ability to perceive, understand, use and manage emotional information is a meaningful predictor of success in domains that involve other people, has proven remarkably durable. And what has also proven durable is the finding that this ability is not fixed. It is not something you are born with in a set quantity that remains constant through your life. It is, at every level of its architecture, a trainable set of skills. The neural circuitry that underlies emotional perception and regulation is plastic. It responds to practice the way any complex skill domain does, slowly at first, then with increasing fluency, until behaviors that once required deliberate effort begin to operate at the level of instinct. The tax is real, but so is the refund. And the refund begins with understanding exactly what you are building. The invisible tax is not paid all at once. It is paid in small installments. In the slightly too sharp response to a colleague's criticism, in the meeting where you did not notice that the energy had shifted until it was too late to respond, in the relationship where you said the technically correct thing at the emotionally wrong moment and watched something in the other person close. Each of these moments is small. Together, over years, they are enormous. What I want you to begin doing right now, even before we move into the specific skills and frameworks, is to stop explaining those moments away. Stop attributing them to bad luck, difficult people, or circumstances that were outside your control. Start asking a different question. What was I not seeing in that moment? What information was available to me that I did not know how to read? What was happening in the other person, or in the room, or in myself, that I did not have the awareness or the tools to track? That question, what was I not seeing, is the beginning of everything. It is the question that turns emotional experience from something that happens to you into something you can observe, understand, and ultimately influence. It is the question I should have been asking long before that meeting at 31. But it is never too late to start asking it. The tax has been running long enough. It is time to understand what you have actually been paying for, and what you get back when you stop paying it. The 5 pillars. Before you can build anything, you need to understand its architecture. Emotional intelligence is not a single thing. It is a structure. 5 distinct, but deeply interconnected, capabilities, each one dependent on the others, each one trainable on its own terms. People who seem naturally gifted in this domain have typically developed all 5, whether through deliberate effort or through the accumulated wisdom of years of social experience. People who struggle in certain relational or professional domains have almost always developed some of these capabilities while leaving others underdeveloped. Understanding the architecture is not academic. It is diagnostic. When you know which pillar is weakest in your own structure, you know exactly where to direct your effort for maximum return. The first pillar is self-awareness, and it is foundational in the most literal sense. Nothing else in the architecture functions properly without it. Self-awareness is the capacity to know what you are feeling as you are feeling it. Not in retrospect, after the emotional response has already shaped your behavior. Not in therapy, when you are excavating the past with professional assistance. In real time, in the middle of the meeting, the conversation, the conflict, the high-stakes moment when your emotional state is exerting its strongest influence on your behavior. Most people have a dramatically lower level of real-time emotional self-awareness than they believe they do. They know, in a general sense, that they get defensive when criticized. They know that certain people irritate them. They know that high-pressure situations make them anxious. But knowing these things, in the abstract, is profoundly different from catching them as they happen. The lag between the emotional trigger and the conscious awareness of it is, for most people, long enough that the behavior has already been shaped by the emotion before the person even knows the emotion was there. You have seen this play out. The person who says something cutting in a meeting and then spends the next hour insisting they were just being direct. The executive who makes a poor decision under pressure and explains it as a strategic calculation. The partner who withdraws from a conversation and then genuinely believes they were simply being quiet, not hurt. In each case, the emotion was present and operating. The awareness simply was not there to intercept it. Self-awareness also extends to understanding your patterns, the specific triggers that reliably activate particular emotional responses, the contexts in which your emotional management tends to break down, and the physical sensations that signal a shift in your internal state before your conscious mind has registered it. Your body knows what you are feeling before your brain does. Tension in the jaw, tightening in the chest, a slight quickening of the breath, pressure behind the eyes. These are not just physical sensations. They are data, early warning signals that your nervous system is sending about your emotional state in real time. The people who develop high self-awareness learn to read this somatic data fluently. They have, in effect, installed an inner dashboard that continuously monitors their emotional and physiological state and makes that information available to conscious awareness. This is not a natural gift. It is a practice. And like all practices, it starts awkward and becomes automatic. The second pillar is self-regulation, and it is where self-awareness pays its first dividend. Self-regulation is the capacity to choose your response to an emotion rather than simply enacting it. It is the space between stimulus and reaction, the pause that allows you to be a conscious participant in your own behavior rather than a passenger in it. What self-regulation is not is suppression. The person who locks their emotions away, who performs a steady affect over churning internal chaos, who has learned to smile through situations that would leave a less controlled person visibly shaking, that person is not self-regulated. They are suppressed, and suppression is expensive. It consumes cognitive resources, erodes physiological health over time, and has an uncanny way of leaking into behavior in indirect forms, through passive hostility, through sudden blow-ups that seem disproportionate to their immediate trigger, through a subtle emotional flatness that others feel even when they cannot name it. Genuine self-regulation is something different. It is the ability to feel emotions fully, to let them register, to honor the information they carry, to allow the physiological arousal to move through the body. while simultaneously maintaining the capacity to choose what you do with that feeling. The emotion does not disappear. It becomes manageable. And in becoming manageable, it becomes useful. The third pillar is motivation, and it is the one most often underestimated in conversations about emotional intelligence. What the research on emotionally intelligent people consistently reveals is that they are driven by something internal, a set of values, a sense of purpose, a genuine orientation toward growth that sustains them through difficulty in ways that external motivation cannot. Money, recognition, status, these are real motivators, and no serious account of human psychology ignores them. But they are brittle. They depend on circumstances that are not fully within your control. They can be withheld, adjusted, or made irrelevant by changes in the environment. Internal motivation is different. It is the kind of commitment that does not require the external environment to cooperate in order to persist. And this quality, the ability to stay oriented toward growth and contribution even when the feedback from the environment is indifferent or hostile, turns out to be one of the most significant differentiators between people who build genuine competence over time and people who plateau. The fourth pillar is empathy, and it is perhaps the most widely misunderstood of the five. Empathy is not sympathy. It is not the performance of concern. It is not even the feeling of caring about another person, though caring helps. Empathy, in the technical sense that the research uses, is the capacity to accurately perceive and represent another person's emotional state, to understand what they are feeling from the inside, not just to observe what they are displaying from the outside. Most people believe they are more empathetic than they actually are. What they are, in most cases, is projective. They observe another person's behavior and emotion, and they interpret it through the filter of their own emotional framework, asking, in effect, how would I feel in that situation? And they arrive at an answer that may or may not have anything to do with how the other person actually feels. Because other people are not you. They have different histories, different nervous systems, different beliefs about what situations mean. The interpretation that feels obvious to you may be almost entirely wrong about them. True empathy requires something harder than projection. It requires setting your own framework aside, temporarily, deliberately, and genuinely inquiring into another person's experience. It requires curiosity that is stronger than your need to be right about what they are feeling. And it requires the willingness to be surprised, to find out that what seemed obvious from the outside is not at all what is happening on the inside. The fifth pillar is social skills, the domain in which all four previous pillars find their practical expression. Social skills in this framework are not the repertoire of techniques that allow you to make small talk at parties or present well in meetings, though those things have their uses. They are the applied capacity to use your self-awareness, your emotional regulation, your empathy, and your internal motivation to navigate the full complexity of human interaction, to build genuine trust, to influence without coercion, to resolve conflict without destruction, to inspire without manipulation. The five pillars do not develop independently. They inform and amplify each other in ways that create compounding returns. Self-awareness without regulation leaves you watching yourself make the same mistakes with increasing clarity and diminishing ability to stop. Regulation without awareness is suppression in a different suit. Empathy without social skill is a sensitivity that never translates into effective action. Social skill without empathy is technique without substance, the kind of polished surface that works in the short run and erodes trust in the long one. Building emotional intelligence means building all five, in roughly the sequence they appear here, with the understanding that each one you develop makes the others easier to access. The person with strong self-awareness finds regulation more natural. The person with strong regulation has more attentional bandwidth available for empathy. The person with genuine empathy finds that social skills become less effortful because they are responding to what is actually there, rather than performing for an audience they cannot fully see. This is the architecture. Everything that follows in this book is, in one way or another, a detailed instruction manual for one or more of these 5 pillars. Keep the structure in mind as we go. When you encounter a skill that does not seem to be developing as quickly as you would like, the question to ask is not what is wrong with the technique. The question is, which pillar does this technique depend on? And is that pillar solid enough to support it? Most of the time, the answer will point you back to self-awareness. Because self-awareness is where all of this begins. What faces don't lie about the human face has 43 muscles. That is more than any other comparably sized surface area of the body, and the reason for that density is not cosmetic. It is communicative. Over millions of years of social evolution, the human face developed into an extraordinarily high bandwidth channel for transmitting emotional information, faster than language, more precise than gesture, and, crucially, harder to fully control than either. This last quality is what makes the face such a reliable source of emotional intelligence data. People control their facial expressions constantly, in professional settings, in social situations, in any context where they are performing a version of themselves that differs from what they are actually experiencing. But the control is imperfect. It operates at the level of deliberate, conscious effort. And beneath that deliberate effort, the face continues to express what the person is actually feeling, in flashes that last fractions of a second before the conscious override reasserts itself. The psychologist Paul Ekman spent decades documenting these micro-expressions, brief, involuntary facial movements that leak authentic emotional content before the person's conscious composure reimposes itself. His research demonstrated something remarkable, that across vastly different cultures, geographies, and languages, the same basic emotional configurations appear on the human face in recognizably consistent forms. The configuration of muscles that produces the expression of genuine fear is not arbitrary. It is ancient, and it is shared. What this means practically is that the face provides a source of emotional information that operates largely below the level of deliberate deception. People can tell you they are fine when they are not. They can perform enthusiasm they do not feel, or calm they have not achieved. But the face tends to tell a different story in the moments before the performance catches up with the feeling. Genuine positive emotion, what Ekman called the Duchenne smile, after the 19th century French neurologist who identified its distinctive muscular signature, involves not just the mouth, but the entire upper face. The orbicularis oculi muscles around the eyes contract, producing the characteristic crinkling at the outer corners and a slight lifting of the cheeks. This is involuntary. People cannot reliably produce it on demand. And this is why the person who is genuinely pleased looks noticeably different from the person who is performing pleasedness, even when the observer cannot articulate exactly what the difference is. Fear activates a distinctive pattern. The brow pulls upward and together. The upper eyelids rise, the lower eyelids tense, and the lips often stretch horizontally. Anger produces a different configuration. Brows pulled down and together, eyes narrowed, jaw set, lips either pressed together or opened. Disgust involves a distinct wrinkling of the nose and raising of the upper lip. Sadness draws the inner corners of the brow upward and together in a way that is extremely difficult to produce voluntarily, which is why convincing fake sadness is so hard to perform. These are not tricks for catching liars, though the research has application in that domain. They are the vocabulary of a language that every human being is broadcasting, continuously, whether or not anyone in the room has the literacy to read it. Developing that literacy is one of the most consequential investments you can make in your emotional intelligence. Here is how to begin. The first practice is what I call expanded awareness. In conversation, most people have a relatively narrow focal point. They are looking at the other person's eyes for signs of engagement, or at their mouth for the words coming out of it. Expanded awareness means gently widening your perceptual field to include the whole face without staring intently at any particular part of it. This is a soft focus rather than a hard one. You are not scrutinizing. You are receiving. Allow the outer corners of the eyes, the forehead, the area around the mouth, the jaw, to all be part of your field of awareness simultaneously. The brain is extraordinarily good at pattern recognition when it is given permission to operate at this wider scale. Most people have the basic hardware to read faces with considerable accuracy. They simply have not trained themselves to pay attention. The expanded awareness practice is, in its early stages, just about paying attention, about noticing what is there. Before you can accurately interpret what you are seeing, you need to develop the habit of actually looking. The second practice is baseline calibration. Every person has a resting facial configuration, a default arrangement of their features that reflects neither strong positive nor strong negative emotion. To read deviations from that baseline accurately, you need to know what the baseline looks like. This means spending the early part of any interaction simply observing the other person's neutral state. How do they look when they are relaxed and comfortable? What does their default eye tension look like? What position does their mouth typically rest in? What is their normal brow configuration? Once you have a baseline, deviation from it becomes interpretable. The person who normally has a relaxed forehead and then suddenly develops tension between the brows in response to a particular topic is telling you something. The person who usually makes easy eye contact and then briefly breaks it at a specific moment in the conversation is signaling something worth noticing. Without the baseline, you would miss both. The third practice is congruence checking. Human beings communicate on multiple channels simultaneously: face, voice, body, words, and those channels are not always saying the same thing. When someone's face tells one story and their words tell another, the face is almost always the more honest narrator. The smile that does not reach the eyes, the enthusiasm in the voice that is not reflected in the face, the stated confidence paired with the briefly visible micro-expression of doubt. These incongruences are not red flags in the sense of indicating deception necessarily. More often, they indicate internal complexity, a person who is managing competing emotions, who is uncertain about something they have not yet articulated, or who is performing a social role that does not fully align with what they are experiencing. Noticing incongruence is valuable not because it tells you what a person is hiding, but because it tells you that there is more to the conversation than the surface. It is an invitation to create space through a well-timed question, through a gentle observation, through simply pausing and allowing silence to do what questions sometimes cannot. When you notice that the person you are talking with is broadcasting emotional complexity, you have an opportunity. You can acknowledge it, explore it, or simply hold it with awareness while the conversation continues. What you do with it depends on the context and the relationship, but you cannot do anything with information you have not first noticed. Body. Language extends the story the face begins. The torso is particularly communicative. When people are engaged and interested, they tend to orient their body toward you, shoulders squaring, center of gravity slightly forward. When they are withdrawing emotionally, the body often follows before they are consciously aware of the withdrawal. Shoulders angle away, weight shifts back. The crossing of the arms is the famous example, though its meaning is far more context-dependent than popular accounts suggest. What matters is not any single gesture in isolation, but the cluster of signals, taken together, and the way they shift in response to the conversation. Hands are unusually revealing. Under stress, hand movements tend to become more contained. The person grips something, interlaces their fingers, or restricts gesture in ways that suggest internal effort being directed toward management. When people are comfortable and engaged, hand gestures tend to be more expressive, flowing, and congruent with what they are saying. Pay particular attention to hand movements that seem disconnected from the content of speech. The person who is saying they are confident, but whose hands are gripping the table, or the person who claims to be unconcerned, but whose fingers are moving in repetitive, self-soothing patterns. Voice adds another layer still. The pace of speech under stress tends to either accelerate, as the person tries to get through a difficult topic quickly, or slow. Noticeably, as careful cognitive control is applied to each word, pitch tends to rise under anxiety and lower under confidence. The quality of resonance changes. Stress often produces a tightness in the throat that strips some of the depth from the voice. These vocal signals operate below most people's conscious attention, which means they are transmitted honestly even by people who are working hard to manage their presentation. None of this is about becoming a human polygraph. The purpose of learning to read people at this level is not to expose or destabilize them. It is to understand them, to have access to the full richness of the communication they are actually transmitting rather than only the thin layer they are consciously performing. When you can read what is actually happening in the person in front of you, you can respond to what is actually happening. You can offer what is actually needed. You can time your words to the emotional rhythm of the conversation rather than imposing your own rhythm on top of it. And in doing so, you become the rarest thing in most people's experience, a person who actually sees them. The pause that changes everything. In the late 1960s, the psychologist Walter Mischel ran a series of experiments at Stanford University that would become one of the most cited findings in developmental psychology. Children were placed in a room with a marshmallow and told they could eat it immediately or wait 15 minutes and receive a second. Marshmallow. Mischel was interested in self-control, in what predicted the capacity to delay gratification. But the longer-term follow-up studies that tracked these children into adulthood revealed something that went considerably beyond the question of marshmallows. The children who could wait, who could sit with the discomfort of deferred gratification and not act on the immediate impulse, showed substantially better outcomes across multiple life domains decades later. What those children had, and what the children who could not wait lacked, was not willpower in the crude sense. It was something more specific and more learnable, the capacity to insert a space between the experience of an impulse and the behavior that followed it. To pause, to become, however briefly, an observer of their own internal state rather than simply an actor moved by it. This pause, the space between stimulus and response, is the operational core of emotional self-regulation. Every technique, every practice, every framework in the self-regulation domain is, at bottom, a method for expanding that space, for making it more reliable, for filling it with something more useful than the automatic reaction that would have occupied it before. Viktor Frankl, writing from experience that most of us are grateful never to have had, described this space as the location of human freedom. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Frankl found that space in a Nazi concentration camp. You are likely to find it in meetings, in difficult conversations, in the accumulated friction of daily life. The principle is the same. Most people collapse that space to nearly nothing. The trigger arrives and the response follows so quickly that the two seem indistinguishable, as if the external event directly produced the behavior, with no internal process in between. This is not because the space does not exist. It is because it has never been cultivated. It has been collapsed by habit, by the accumulated weight of unchallenged automatic responses, until it is so thin as to be functionally invisible. The neuroscience of this process is worth understanding. When you encounter a stimulus that your nervous system registers as threatening, which includes not just physical threats, but social threats, threats to status, threats to identity, threats to your beliefs about how the world is supposed to work, a structure in your brain called the amygdala activates rapidly and sends signals that prepare the body for defensive action. Heart rate increases, breathing shifts, cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for deliberate, strategic, forward-looking thought, is temporarily impaired by this flood. The neurologist Daniel Siegel calls this state being hijacked. It is not a metaphor. In a full amygdala hijack, your capacity for rational, considered response is genuinely compromised. The recovery time from this state, absent any deliberate intervention, is typically several minutes at minimum. And during those minutes, you are operating with reduced cognitive capacity, heightened reactivity, and a strong pull toward the defensive or aggressive behaviors that the threat response system has prepared you for. Understanding this is not an excuse for poor behavior. It is a map, and maps are useful because they show you where the terrain is difficult and where alternative routes are available. The physiological reset is the most direct available route. When the amygdala activates, the body enters a state dominated by the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight branch of the autonomic system that mobilizes resources for action. The parasympathetic nervous system, the branch associated with calm, restoration, and considered response, can be activated deliberately through specific breathing patterns. An extended exhale is the most reliable trigger. When the exhalation is longer than the inhalation, the vagus nerve is stimulated, and the parasympathetic response begins to counteract the sympathetic activation. This is why the instruction to take a breath before responding is not a cliché. It is physiology. The specific pattern that is most effective is a 4-count inhalation through the nose, a brief hold, and a 6-count exhalation through the mouth. 3 to 5 repetitions of this pattern are usually sufficient to begin shifting the nervous system state. The muscles consciously relax, starting from the forehead, moving down through the jaw, the shoulders, the arms, the abdomen. The perceptual field, which narrows during threat response, begins to widen again. From that widened state, the pause becomes possible. The space opens, and in that space, choice becomes available. But physiology is only part of the story. The pause also requires what might be called cognitive interception, the ability to catch the story your mind is building about what just happened and subject it to examination before acting on it. Because the emotional response to any event is not a response to the event itself. It is a response to the meaning you have assigned to it. Two people can receive identical critical feedback in identical circumstances and have dramatically different emotional responses, not because their nervous systems are different, but because the meaning they assign to that feedback is different. One person hears it as information that might help them improve. The other hears it as evidence that they are inadequate. The emotional response follows the meaning, not the event. Cognitive reframing, choosing deliberately a different meaning than the one that arose automatically, is one of the most powerful tools available for expanding the pause. And it is more tractable than it might sound, because the automatic meanings that trigger the strongest emotional responses are usually not the only available interpretation of what happened. They are just the first one, the one that the pattern recognition machinery of the brain generated based on prior experience, prior wounds, prior beliefs about how the world works. When someone criticizes your work, the first meaning your brain might generate is that you are being dismissed, diminished, or judged as incompetent. That meaning activates a threat response. The pause gives you the opportunity to generate alternative meanings. That the person is trying to help you improve, that they care enough about the outcome to risk the social friction of honesty, that their perspective, however delivered, contains information worth examining. None of these alternative meanings require you to pretend the criticism did not land. They simply give you more interpretive options, and more options mean more choice about how to respond. The STOP method offers a practical structure for deploying the pause in real time. The S is for stop. Physically interrupt whatever automatic response has begun. Put down the phone. Close the laptop. Set down whatever is in your hands. The T is for take a breath. Use the physiological reset. The O is for observe. Notice what you are feeling, where you feel it in your body, and what story your mind is generating about the situation. The P is for proceed with intention. Choose your next action based not on the emotional momentum of the moment, but on what you actually want to achieve. The first time you use this method, it will feel awkward and artificial. It will feel like a performance of calmness rather than the real thing. That is fine. The awkwardness is the learning. The neural pathways that support automatic emotional reactivity have been reinforced over many years of use. The pathways that support deliberate, regulated response are being built. New construction is always more laborious than using existing roads, but the roads get easier as they are, traveled more often. The pause is also, it should be noted, an act of respect toward the other person. When you respond automatically from an activated emotional state, you are not really responding to them. You are responding to the meaning your nervous system generated in the first fraction of a second of stimulus processing. You are, in effect, talking to a projection of your own internal dynamics rather than to the actual person in front of you. The pause makes genuine contact possible. It is what allows you to respond to what is actually happening rather than to what your nervous system has decided is probably happening. Some of the most important moments in your relationships, your career, and your own development will turn on whether you manage to pause. Not because pausing produces perfect outcomes, it does not, but because it makes thoughtful outcomes possible. It makes you a participant in your own behavior, and that participation is, ultimately, what distinguishes someone who moves through life with emotional intelligence from someone who moves through it at the mercy of their own reactions. The marshmallow was never really about the marshmallow. It was about this: the ability to be in the presence of a powerful impulse and choose. That is the pause. And it changes everything. Wired to feel. There is a story that gets told about emotion and reason that is so pervasive, so deeply embedded in Western thinking, that most people take it as obvious fact without ever questioning it. The story goes like this: reason and emotion are two separate systems, fundamentally in competition with each other. Reason is what we aspire to. Emotion is what gets in the way. The ideal is to be more rational, to manage our feelings well enough that they do not interfere with clear thinking, good decisions, and effective action. This story is wrong. Not partially, not at the margins. Foundationally wrong. And the neuroscientific research of the last 3 decades has dismantled it in ways that have enormous implications for how you understand your own experience, and for why developing emotional intelligence is not about learning to manage a problematic system, but about developing full access to one of your most powerful cognitive tools. The neurologist Antonio Damasio spent years studying patients who had sustained damage to the prefrontal cortex, specifically to the regions that integrate emotional processing with decision-making. These patients were, in many respects, cognitively intact, their reasoning abilities, their memory, their language, all preserved. What they had lost was their ability to feel emotions in the ordinary range and intensity. And what Damasio found, consistently, was that this loss of feeling did not make them better decision-makers. It made them almost incapable of making decisions at all. Confronted with choices, even simple, everyday choices, these patients would analyze endlessly, generating logical arguments for and against each option, but without the emotional signal that gives one option significance over another, they could not arrive at a decision. The emotion was not interfering with their reasoning. It was, Damasio concluded, an essential component of reasoning. Without the somatic markers, the emotional signals that attach value and significance to different outcomes, the reasoning process had no basis for priority, no basis for concluding that one thing mattered more than another. Damasio called this the somatic marker hypothesis, and it has profound implications. It suggests that every value judgment, every determination that something is important, every sense that one course of action is preferable to another, is grounded in emotional experience. The logic you use to justify your decisions is real, but it is downstream of the emotional signal that told you the decision mattered in the first place. Reason and emotion are not competing systems. They are integrated systems, and they work best when they are working together. This reframing changes the goal of emotional intelligence development. You are not trying to become less emotional. You are trying to become more emotionally fluent, more capable of receiving the information that your emotional system is transmitting with accuracy and clarity, more capable of using that information in the service of thoughtful action. The person who suppresses emotion is not more rational. They are operating with degraded access to critical decision-relevant information. They are flying partly blind. The architecture of the emotional brain is worth understanding in rough outline. The amygdala, which we discussed in the previous chapter, is the brain's primary threat detection organ. It operates at extraordinary speed, processing incoming sensory data and generating an alarm response before the cortex has had time to form a conscious representation of what the threat even is. This is adaptive for obvious reasons. In an environment where some threats move fast enough to be fatal before you have finished thinking about them, speed matters more than accuracy. But the amygdala is not highly discriminating. It responds to social and psychological threats with essentially the same urgency as physical threats. The experience of being publicly criticized, of having your social status undermined, of facing rejection from a group that matters to you, these register in the amygdala as dangers, and the threat response they trigger is neurologically similar to the one produced by physical danger. This is why emotional regulation is not simply a matter of telling yourself to calm down. The activated threat system does not respond to verbal reassurance. It responds to physiological signals. It responds to the slow exhale. It responds to the body's communication to the nervous system that the danger has passed. The prefrontal cortex, the large, evolutionarily recent structure at the front of the brain, provides the regulation. It receives input from the amygdala, but it can also, with sufficient development and practice, modulate the amygdala's response. The connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is bidirectional, but it is not symmetric. The bottom-up influence of the amygdala on the cortex is faster and, under conditions of significant stress, more powerful than the top-down regulatory influence of the cortex on the amygdala. This is the neurological basis of the emotional hijack. And it is why developing emotional regulation is not about developing stronger willpower. It is about developing stronger neural pathways for regulatory influence. Through practice, through repetition, through the accumulated experience of successfully managing emotional activation over time. The anterior cingulate cortex is another structure worth knowing about. It sits at the intersection of the emotional and cognitive brain and plays a crucial role in what might be called emotional attention. The ability to keep emotionally salient information in awareness without being overwhelmed by it. People with well-developed anterior cingulate function can hold difficult emotions in consciousness while continuing to reason, plan, and act effectively. This capacity, the ability to be with a difficult feeling while simultaneously doing something useful, is one of the neurological signatures of emotional resilience. Mirror neurons, discovered accidentally in the early 1990s by a team of Italian researchers studying motor control in macaque monkeys, provided the first neurological mechanism for empathy. These neurons fire not only when an animal performs an action, but when it observes another animal performing that same action. The discovery of mirror neurons in human brains suggested a biological basis for the experience of feeling what another person feels, a capacity that operates below conscious processing, in the shared substrate of our nervous systems. What this means in practical terms is that emotional contagion, the spreading of emotional states from person to person, is not a social phenomenon layered on top of individual psychology. It is a neurological process. When you are in the presence of someone experiencing strong emotion, your mirror neuron system begins to generate a representation of that emotional state in your own brain. You begin, at some level, to feel what they feel. This happens automatically, rapidly, and without any deliberate choice on your part. This is simultaneously the biological basis of empathy and the reason that emotional management matters beyond your own experience. Your emotional state does not stay inside you. It propagates into rooms, into relationships, into the nervous systems of the people around you. The person who learns to manage their own emotional state with skill is not just managing their own experience. They are shaping the emotional environment that everyone they interact with inhabits. That is, influence of the deepest and most non-manipulative kind, influence at the level of shared neurological experience. Understanding all of this changes the relationship most people have with their own emotions. The anger you feel when your boundaries are violated is not a character flaw to be overcome. It is information, a signal that something important to you is being transgressed and that action may be required. The anxiety you feel before a high-stakes interaction is not weakness. It is preparation. Your nervous system mobilizing resources, sharpening attention, making sure you are ready. The grief you feel when you lose something you loved is not instability. It is the measure of how much it mattered. The goal is not to feel less. The goal is to feel more accurately, to receive the information your emotional system is transmitting with enough clarity that you know what the feeling is actually about, what it is telling you, and what response it warrants. That is emotional literacy, and it begins, as all literacy does, with learning the language. Your emotions have been trying to tell you things your whole life. The question is whether you have been equipped to listen. Emotional Intelligence and Social Mastery. Full audiobook script. Part 2 of 3. The confidence you build, not find. There is a particular kind of advice about confidence that has done enormous damage to an enormous number of people. It goes something like this. Just believe in yourself. Act as if. Fake it until you make it. The implicit premise is that confidence is a feeling, a state of internal certainty that you either have or you do not, and that the path to having it is to perform it convincingly enough that eventually the performance becomes real. This advice is not entirely wrong. There is legitimate research on the feedback loop between posture, physiology, and internal state, on the way that adopting a more expansive physical bearing can, under certain conditions, generate a modest shift in how confident a person feels. But as a primary strategy for building lasting social confidence, the perform it until you feel it approach has a fundamental problem. It is backwards. Genuine confidence, the kind that does not require constant maintenance, that does not collapse under challenge, that does not need favorable external conditions in order to persist, is not a feeling that precedes competence. It is a feeling that follows it. It is the natural byproduct of developing real skills in a domain, encountering difficulty within that domain, and discovering that you can handle it. The feeling is the consequence of the competence. You cannot reliably manufacture the feeling in the absence of the competence and expect it to hold. Nowhere is this more true than in the domain of social interaction. Social confidence that is built on performance rather than skill is extraordinarily fragile. It works until the first moment of genuine challenge, until someone pushes back hard, until the conversation goes somewhere unexpected, until you are in a social environment that does not match the one you practiced for. At that point, the performance falters, and because the confidence was built on the performance rather than on actual capability, the confidence falters with it. What builds social confidence that holds is the development of specific, learnable social competencies. Skills that give you genuine capability in the situations that previously felt threatening. When you actually know how to read what is happening in a conversation, you do not need to perform confidence about your ability to navigate it. When you actually know how to regulate your own emotional state under social pressure, you do not need to pretend you are comfortable. When you actually know how to create genuine connection with a wide range of people, you do not need to fake interest in them. The confidence is simply the accurate recognition of your own capability. The first of these, competencies, is what I call authentic self-presentation, knowing, with enough clarity and specificity, that it is actually usable in real time, who you are and what you bring to any given interaction. Most people have a much hazier sense of this than they realize. They know their job title, their professional background, their general interests, but they do not have a clear, articulable sense of what is distinctively theirs, what perspective they bring that is not simply a recombination of other people's perspectives, what value they create that is not just a function of their role, what quality of presence they offer that makes an interaction with them meaningfully different from an interaction with someone else. This matters more than it might seem, because without that clarity, every social interaction carries an implicit question underneath it. Who am I supposed to be in this room? And the mental energy spent managing that question is energy that cannot be spent on genuine engagement with the people in the room. The person who has a clear, stable sense of their own identity and value does not need to figure out who to be. They simply show up and are that person. And the resulting quality of presence, the groundedness, the ease, the lack of self-monitoring anxiety, is exactly what other people experience as confidence. Building that clarity is not a one-time exercise. It is an ongoing practice of self-inquiry. What do I actually think about this? Not what am I supposed to think? What do I genuinely care about? Not what am I supposed to care about? What are the qualities of my experience and perspective that are mine specifically, that I bring regardless of the context I am in? The answers to these questions, developed over time through honest reflection, become the foundation of authentic self-presentation. A foundation that does not require maintenance because it is simply true. The second competency is conversational fluency, the ability to create and sustain interactions that leave people feeling genuinely engaged, understood, and energized. Most people's conversational defaults are either too passive, letting the interaction be shaped entirely by the other person, or too active, filling every silence with their own content without leaving adequate space for the other person to contribute. Conversational fluency is something more dynamic, a capacity to move between listening and speaking, between asking and sharing, in ways that create genuine dialogue rather than parallel monologue. The foundation of conversational fluency is curiosity, not performed curiosity, the head nodding, the strategic question asked as a prelude to your own next point, but genuine interest in the other person's experience, perspective, and inner world. People can feel the difference between being genuinely inquired into and being socially processed. When someone is truly curious about you, the quality of their attention is different. Their questions go somewhere. They build on what you say rather than redirecting toward their own agenda. The conversation has a quality of going somewhere together rather than each person waiting for their turn. Developing genuine curiosity is, for some people, a practice in itself. It requires consciously setting aside the mental habit of treating every social interaction as a performance to be evaluated and replacing it with the orientation of genuine exploration. Every person you meet has a life of enormous complexity and texture that you know almost nothing about. Every conversation is an opportunity to learn something real about how human experience works, which is one of the most inexhaustible and fascinating subjects available to any curious mind. When you approach social interaction from that orientation, the curiosity tends to become genuine rather than forced, because there really is always something interesting there if you are actually looking. The third competency is the management of social anxiety, not its elimination, which is neither possible nor necessary, but its containment to a level where it no longer impairs your performance. Some degree of social anxiety is neurologically normal. The social evaluation system in the brain is real, and it is designed to care about social outcomes. The question is not whether you feel it, but whether you have developed sufficient skill to function effectively while you feel it. The most reliable method for containing social anxiety in real time is what psychologists call attentional redirection, deliberately shifting your focus from your internal experience to the external situation. Social anxiety is predominantly inward-focused. It is the mind rehearsing its own potential failure, monitoring its own performance, anticipating the negative judgment of others. This internal focus is self-amplifying. The more you monitor your own anxiety, the more anxious you tend to become, which gives you more anxiety to monitor, and so on. Redirecting attention outward, toward the other person, toward genuine curiosity about their experience, toward what is actually happening in the interaction rather than what might go wrong in it, breaks this cycle. Not because the anxiety disappears, but because the attentional resources that were feeding it have been redirected elsewhere. The anxiety can continue operating in the background while you operate effectively in the foreground. Over time, with repeated successful experiences of Managing this way, the anxiety itself tends to diminish because the pattern recognition system of the brain updates its model of social situations to include the information that you can handle them. Physical presence is the fourth competency, and it is more foundational than it is often given credit for. The way you occupy physical space communicates information about your internal state before you have said a word, and perhaps more importantly, it influences your internal state. The posture physiology feedback loop is real, even if its effects are more modest than some popular accounts have claimed. Standing fully upright, taking a breath that fully expands the chest, allowing the shoulders to settle back and down, these are not just signals to others. They are signals to your own nervous system. They initiate a physiological pattern that is more consistent with calm confidence than with social threat response. Eye contact is worth its own attention. The tendency under I. Social anxiety is to either avoid eye contact, which communicates discomfort and is felt by others as a form of absence, or to maintain it so fixedly and unblinkingly that it becomes uncomfortable for the other person. Natural eye contact is neither. It is present without being intense, making genuine contact during moments of emphasis or emotional significance, moving naturally at other moments, always communicating engagement without communicating surveillance. Developing this requires becoming comfortable with your own gaze, comfortable enough with who you are that looking at another person does not feel like an exposure. Voice is the final element of physical presence, and it deserves more attention than most people give it. The voice under social anxiety tends to become faster, higher in pitch, less resonant. It communicates the anxiety non-verbally even when the words are carefully chosen. Deliberately slowing the pace of speech, even marginally, tends to stabilize both the voice and the nervous system behind it. Speaking slightly more slowly than feels natural gives you time to think, reduces the breathlessness that accompanies anxiety, and produces a vocal quality that others register as competent and composed. It is not a performance of confidence. It is a physiological intervention that generates genuine calm. All of these competencies, authentic self-presentation, conversational fluency, anxiety management, physical presence, are skills. They have structure. They improve with practice. And as they improve, the confidence that was supposed to precede them arrives, on schedule, as the natural consequence of capability being developed. You do not need to find it. You need to build it. And you build it in exactly the way you build anything else worth having, through deliberate practice, honest feedback, and the willingness to be imperfect on the way to being good. Influence is not a dirty word. Something happens to many people when they encounter the word influence, a slight recoil, a moral discomfort, as if the very act of seeking to affect another person's beliefs or behavior is suspect, a soft form of manipulation perhaps, or at minimum a betrayal of some ideal of pure, unmediated human communication in which each person simply states their truth and the other person simply receives it. This discomfort is understandable. The history of influence as a subject, particularly in the popular psychology and sales training traditions, contains more than enough material to justify skepticism. There is a vast literature of manipulation techniques dressed in the language of social skill, of psychological levers described with the enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered a way to override another person's judgment. That literature deserves exactly the skepticism it receives, but the discomfort, if it is not examined, leads people to a position that is both intellectually incoherent and practically disabling, because every meaningful human interaction involves influence. Every conversation in which you explain something, every relationship in which you express a need, every professional interaction in which you make a recommendation, in each of these, you are seeking to affect how another person thinks or acts. The question is not whether you will influence. You will. The question is whether you will do it skillfully and ethically, or clumsily and accidentally. The distinction between ethical, influence, and manipulation is not a fine line. It is a fundamental difference in orientation, Manipulation seeks to bypass another person's rational agency, to produce a desired behavior by exploiting a psychological vulnerability, creating a false belief, or leveraging an emotional state in ways the person has not consented to. It works, when it works, by circumventing the other person's capacity to evaluate what is actually in their interest. And its effects are predictably corrosive over time. Trust erodes, relationships hollow out. The person who has been manipulated eventually recognizes, at some level, what happened to them. Ethical influence operates in exactly the opposite direction. It works by helping another person better understand their own interests, better evaluate available options, and make choices that are genuinely aligned with their values and goals. The skilled ethical influencer is not trying to produce a specific behavior in someone who, with full information, would choose differently. They are trying to provide the information, perspective, and emotional context that allows the other person to make a better decision than they would have made without that input. The outcome serves both parties, or it is not genuinely ethical. Robert Cialdini's decades of research on the psychology of influence identified several consistent mechanisms by which human beings are moved toward decisions, mechanisms that operate not through logic alone, but through the social and emotional circuits that evolved to help us navigate complex social environments efficiently. These mechanisms are not tricks. They are features of normal human psychology. Understanding them is not about learning to exploit them. It is about learning to use them in ways that serve everyone involved, and about recognizing when others are using them in ways that do not. Reciprocity is perhaps the most primitive of these mechanisms, the deeply ingrained human tendency to return what has been received. In any extended social relationship, an imbalance of giving and receiving creates psychological tension that tends to resolve toward reciprocation. This is not selfishness. It is the social glue that allows cooperative relationships to function. The ethical application of this principle is straightforward. If you want people to be generous toward you, be genuinely generous toward them first. Not strategically, not with an internal ledger of what you are owed in return, but from a genuine orientation of contribution. The reciprocity that follows is not guaranteed or immediate, but over time, in ongoing relationships with people of good character, it is remarkably reliable. Social proof describes the human tendency to use others' behavior as information about the right behavior in a given situation, particularly under conditions of uncertainty, where our own judgment does not feel adequate to the decision. This is not irrationality. In a complex world, where we cannot possibly have first-hand expertise in every domain we encounter, using the behavior of others as a proxy for information is often the most rational available heuristic. The ethical application of social proof means providing genuinely relevant examples of how people similar to your audience have benefited from what you are recommending, not manufactured testimonials, not cherry-picked outliers, but honest accounts of real outcomes. Authority speaks to the way people appropriately defer to genuine expertise on matters outside their own knowledge domain. The ethical application of authority requires, first, that the authority being invoked is real, that it reflects actual knowledge, actual expertise, actual track record. Claimed authority without genuine substance is just deception wearing a credential. But genuine expertise, communicated with appropriate confidence, is a legitimate and powerful form of influence. The honest expert who says clearly and directly, "Here is what I know about this, and here is why I believe it," is not manipulating anyone. They are providing valuable information that the other person is in a better position to act on because of the communication. Liking, the well-documented tendency to be more easily influenced by people we like, is one of the mechanisms most vulnerable to manipulation because it is possible to engineer the conditions for liking in ways that are entirely disconnected from any genuine positive regard. The ethical approach is simply this: find authentic common ground. There is almost always genuine connection available if you are looking for it honestly rather than performing it strategically. When you are genuinely interested in another person, genuinely respectful of their perspective, genuinely willing to acknowledge the legitimacy of their concerns even when you disagree, they tend to like you, not because you have deployed a technique, because you have actually shown up. Commitment and consistency describe the psychological tendency to behave in ways that align with prior commitments and stated values. This mechanism is behind the significant body of research showing that people who make explicit commitments to a course of action are more likely to follow through on it, not because the commitment changes the external landscape, but because it activates the internal motivation to be consistent with one's self-concept. The ethical use of this principle involves helping people connect what you are recommending to values and goals they already hold, genuinely hold, not values they are being manipulated into claiming. When someone can see clearly that a proposed action is consistent with who they already are and what they already care about, they are not being pushed. They are being helped to see a connection they might have missed. Scarcity, the tendency to value things more highly when they are rare or time-limited, is perhaps the most frequently abused of these principles because artificial scarcity is so easily manufactured and so reliably effective in the short term. The ethical application is simple and demanding. Only communicate scarcity when it is real. When a genuine deadline exists, communicate it clearly so the person can make an informed decision. When it does not exist, do not pretend otherwise. The short-term gain from manufactured urgency is almost always smaller than the long-term cost in trust. Beyond these 6 mechanisms, the most sophisticated level of ethical influence involves something that is more fundamental than any specific technique. It is the orientation of genuine service, the authentic desire to understand what the other person actually needs and to contribute to their actually getting it, independent of whether that serves your immediate interests. This orientation transforms influence from something you do to people into something you do with them and for them, and it turns out to be, paradoxically, more effective than any manipulation, because people can sense it, and because the relationships it builds provide more durable and more generous returns than the ones built on exploitation. The person who approaches every significant interaction by genuinely asking, what does this person actually need, and how can I contribute to their getting it, is already more influential than 90% of the people who have memorized every persuasion technique in the literature, because they are responsive to reality rather than to a script. And reality, almost always, is more interesting and more yielding than any script could anticipate. The conversations we keep avoiding. There is a particular category of human suffering that is almost entirely self-generated, not by trauma, not by circumstances beyond our control, but by the conversations we did not have, the feedback we swallowed, the boundary we did not articulate, the concern we raised once, cautiously, and dropped when it was not received well, the need we were not sure how to express, so we expressed it sideways, through behavior and withdrawal, until the relationship had been subtly but significantly damaged by the weight of the unsaid. Difficult conversations are the places where emotional intelligence earns its highest return on investment. Not because they are easy, even for people who have developed real skill in this domain, they are not, but because the gap between skilled and unskilled navigation of these conversations is so large, and the consequences of avoidance so reliably significant, that even modest improvement in this area tends to produce outsized changes in the quality of a person's professional and personal relationships. The avoidance is understandable. Difficult conversations trigger the threat system. They involve the risk of rejection, conflict, the disruption of a relationship we depend on or value. The short-term cost of having the conversation often feels higher than the cost of continuing to carry the unresolved issue, and the short-term assessment is not entirely wrong. Difficult conversations do carry risk, and they do have costs. The problem is that the long-term calculation is almost always the opposite. The issue does not resolve itself, it compounds. The unspoken accumulates until it has become a weight that the relationship cannot carry, or until an explosion happens that is wildly disproportionate to its visible trigger because it is carrying the pressure of everything that preceded it. The first thing to understand about difficult conversations is that they are not debates. They are not opportunities to prove that you are right. The people who approach difficult conversations from a winning orientation almost always make them worse, because the person they are talking to, sensing that they are in a competition, adopts a defensive posture, and once both parties are defending rather than exploring, the conversation has no place to go, except toward entrenchment and damage. The orientation that works is collaborative inquiry. You are not there to deliver a verdict. You are there to understand something you do not fully understand, and to share something that the other person may not fully understand, and to see if the two of you can, together, make sense of a situation that is not working and find a way forward that is better than the current one. This orientation, genuinely held, not just performed, changes the quality of every element of the conversation, the tone of your opening, the questions you ask, the way you receive pushback, the way you handle silence. Preparation is where most people fail before the conversation even begins. They either avoid preparing entirely, telling themselves the conversation will go better if it is spontaneous, or they prepare in the wrong way, rehearsing arguments and anticipating objections as if they are about to enter a courtroom. Effective preparation is about understanding, not about winning. Before a difficult conversation, the most useful preparation involves three things. First, genuine inquiry into the other person's perspective. Before you articulate your own concern, spend real time considering what the situation looks like from their position. What pressures are they under that you may not have full visibility into? What might your behavior look like from where they are standing? What legitimate concerns might they have that you have not fully accounted for? This is not about abandoning your perspective. It is about being genuinely informed enough about theirs to have a real conversation rather than a collision of monologues. Second, emotional preparation. You need to arrive at this conversation in a state that is regulated enough to actually hear what the other person says, including things that are difficult or uncomfortable to hear. If you are activated before the conversation begins, you will not be able to listen well, and listening well is the single most important thing you can do in a difficult conversation. The physiological reset, the cognitive reframing, the deliberate intention setting before you begin, these are not luxuries. They are the preparation that makes everything else possible. Third, clarity about your own intention. Before you open your mouth, you need to know what you actually want from this conversation, not what you want to say, not what outcome you want to force. What genuine need or concern this conversation is meant to address, and what a genuinely good outcome for both people would look like. That clarity will guide you when the conversation becomes more complicated than you anticipated, which it almost always will. The opening of a difficult conversation determines more of its trajectory than any other single element. People are extraordinarily sensitive to the emotional tone of an opening, to whether they are being approached with openness or with judgment, with care or with aggression. The soft start, beginning with acknowledgement before concern, is not manipulation. It is an accurate representation of the fact that you are bringing both a genuine relationship and a genuine concern to this conversation, and that both deserve to be present from the beginning. I want to talk about something that has been on my mind, and I want to start by saying that I am bringing this up because this relationship matters to me. That kind of opening does not soften the concern that follows. It contextualizes it, places it in the frame of care and mutual investment that makes it possible for the other person to receive it as something other than an attack. The middle of a difficult conversation is where most people lose the thread. The emotion escalates. Someone says something that activates the other person's defense system. The conversation begins to drift from the original concern toward a sprawling set of grievances and counterattacks that may be real but are not helping anyone. Staying on track requires two things: a clear sense of where you are trying to go, and the ability to acknowledge emotions, yours and theirs, without being derailed by them. Acknowledging emotions is the step most often skipped, and it is the one that most often determines whether a difficult conversation becomes productive or destructive. When someone is feeling accused, unheard, or disrespected, their capacity for rational engagement drops precipitously. They are in the threat response, and no amount of logical argumentation will reach them while they are in that state. What reaches them is the experience of being understood, of feeling that their emotional reality has been registered and taken seriously, even if it has not changed the substance of the concern being raised. This sounds like, "I can hear that you are frustrated with how this has unfolded, and I understand why." That is not a concession. It is an acknowledgement. It communicates that you see the other person as a full human being with a legitimate internal experience, not just as an obstacle between you and the outcome you want. And that acknowledgement, made genuinely, does something remarkable. It tends to reduce the defensive activation, because the threat that was generating it was partly the threat of not being seen. Once that threat is addressed, the person's capacity for genuine engagement often returns quite quickly. The collaborative phase is where the conversation can actually move somewhere useful. And the key to genuine collaboration is being truly open to outcomes you did not arrive at before the conversation began. If you have already decided what the resolution needs to look like, you are not collaborating. You are negotiating from a fixed position, which is a very different thing, and the other person will feel the difference. Real collaboration requires the genuine possibility that the two of you together will arrive at a solution that neither of you would have arrived at alone. That possibility is worth protecting because in difficult conversations, the jointly arrived at solution tends to be both more creative and more durable than anything one person could have imposed. Close the conversation with specific commitments, not with vague intentions. Not "we will try to do better," but "I will do this specific thing, and you will do this specific thing, and we will check back in on this date to see how it is going." The specificity is not bureaucratic. It is the difference between a difficult conversation that changes something and one that simply provides temporary relief before the same dynamic reasserts itself. After the conversation, do something that most people never do. Reflect on it honestly, not to judge yourself harshly for what you handled imperfectly. Imperfection is guaranteed, but to extract the learning. What did you notice about the other person's emotional state that you responded to well? What did you miss? At what point did the conversation become more difficult, and what was happening just before that? What would you do differently? This reflection is where the skill actually develops, not in the conversation itself, which is too chaotic and fast-moving for much conscious learning, but in the quiet afterward, when you have the cognitive space to see it clearly. The conversations you keep avoiding are not going to get easier with time. The issues they need to address are going to get harder. The courage required to initiate them does not grow through avoidance. It grows through having them, awkwardly at first, better with practice, until the thing that once felt like a precipice begins to feel simply like a door that leads somewhere you needed to go. Your network is your net worth. If you build it right. The phrase has been repeated so many times in professional development circles that it has lost most of its meaning. Your network is your net worth. People nod. They collect business cards, connect on LinkedIn, attend industry events with the quiet desperation of someone mining for gold in a territory that has already been extensively picked over. They go home with a stack of cards they will not sort until they find them months later in a coat pocket, by which time the faces behind the names have dissolved entirely. This is not networking. It is the performance of networking, the motions of relationship building without the substance, conducted by people who have absorbed the message that relationships matter professionally without ever interrogating what that actually means or what it actually requires. What it requires is, in almost every respect, the opposite of what the typical networking event produces. It requires depth over breadth. It requires patience over transactional urgency. It requires a genuine interest in other people's lives and goals that is not instrumentalized, that does not secretly have a bottom line, a favor to be called in, a connection to be leveraged. It requires, in short, the same qualities that make any other kind of relationship genuine, actual care for the person you are in relationship with. The research on professional networks is instructive here. The sociologist Mark Granovetter's foundational work on what he called the strength of weak ties identified something counterintuitive about the structure of valuable professional networks. The people most likely to provide novel opportunities, job leads, partnerships, information about trends you would not have encountered in your usual circles, are not your close friends and immediate colleagues. They are the people you know less well, the acquaintance from a professional event several years ago, the former colleague you stayed in touch with loosely, the person you met through a mutual contact and exchanged a few genuinely engaging conversations with before life pulled you in different directions. The reason is simple. Your close relationships tend to inhabit the same information environment you do. They read the same things, know the same people, operate in the same professional circles. The value they provide is enormous, for support, for honest feedback, for the kind of deep collaboration that requires genuine trust. But for novel opportunities and information from outside your current orbit, the weak ties are where the diversity lives, which means that the health of your network, in the economically meaningful sense, depends not just on the depth of your closest relationships, but on the breadth and quality of your more extended connections, the people you know well enough to reach out to with a specific reason, and who would be genuinely glad to hear from you. Building this kind of network requires a fundamentally different orientation than most people bring to professional relationship development. The transactional orientation, I will invest in this relationship because of what it might yield, is not just ethically uncomfortable. It is practically ineffective. People are exquisitely sensitive to being treated as resources rather than as people. They may not name it consciously, but they feel it. And the relationship that forms under those conditions is a thin one, available for the specific exchange that was implicit in its formation and not much else. The generative orientation is different. It begins with genuine curiosity about the other person, their work, their challenges, their perspective on the field or domain they inhabit. It continues with a consistent disposition toward contribution. What do I know or who do I know that might be useful to this person? Not as a calculated investment, but as an expression of the basic principle that human beings are enriched by helping each other, and that creating value for others tends over time to create value for yourself in ways that cannot be fully anticipated in advance. The value-first approach, giving before asking, contributing before requesting, has a neurological basis. The experience of receiving something valuable from someone activates the reciprocity circuits we discussed in the previous chapter. But more significantly, the experience of someone contributing genuinely to your well-being or success creates something that pure reciprocity does not account for: trust, the deep, bone-level conviction that this person is on your side, that their interest in you is real and not purely instrumental, that they can be counted on when counting on someone actually matters. Trust of that quality is extraordinarily rare in professional contexts and extraordinarily valuable. It is the quality that transforms an acquaintance into a genuine ally, someone who will advocate for you without being asked, who will think of you when opportunities arise that you are not in the room for, who will be honest with you when honesty is what you need rather than what you would prefer to hear. Building that trust requires time and consistency. There are no shortcuts, but there are disciplines that make it more likely. The first is remembering the details. The person who asks, months after a previous conversation, "How did that project turn out?" The one you mentioned last time has demonstrated something that most people cannot demonstrate, that they actually listened, that you were not simply performing attention while waiting for your turn. The remembering communicates that the person mattered enough to hold space in your mind beyond the duration of the interaction. That is a form of generosity, and people feel it. The second discipline is relevance. Staying in touch means nothing if the touch is generic, a checking-in message that could have been sent to anyone in the contact list, and clearly was. Staying in touch in ways that are actually valuable means noticing things in the world, articles, opportunities, events, ideas, that are specifically relevant to the interests, goals, or challenges of a specific person, and sending them with a brief personal note that makes the relevance explicit. This takes more effort than a broadcast message. It also takes more genuine knowledge of the person, but it produces a completely different response because it communicates that you were thinking of them specifically, not managing a relationship, but maintaining a genuine connection. The third discipline is being willing to facilitate connections between other people, to introduce people in your network to each other when you genuinely believe they would benefit from knowing each other. This is one of the highest yield activities available in relationship building because it provides value to two people simultaneously and positions you as someone who creates opportunities rather than just pursuing them. But it only works, and should only be done, when the connection is genuinely likely to be valuable to both parties. A thoughtless introduction wastes everyone's time and mildly damages your credibility for the future. A thoughtful one is long remembered by both people as an example of exactly the kind of generosity that makes someone worth knowing. Relationship depth requires moving beyond the professional surface, not intrusively, not pushing into personal territory before trust has been established, but with a genuine willingness to engage with the person, not just the professional role. Most people have a vivid life outside of work. Interests, relationships, pursuits that matter to them, things they are working through, aspirations they are not sure they will achieve. Showing genuine interest in those dimensions, when appropriate, when trust has been established, when the conversation naturally moves there, is what transforms a professional contact into something that actually feels like a relationship. And it is those relationships that provide the depth of support, the quality of honesty, and the durability of loyalty that make a professional network genuinely valuable rather than merely large. The people who build networks of extraordinary quality do not do it through networking. They do it through being genuinely interested in people, genuinely committed to contributing to others' success, and genuinely consistent over time in ways that demonstrate they mean it. That is not a technique. It is a way of moving through the world, and it produces, in the long run, a professional and personal environment of connection and mutual support that no amount of strategic networking could ever manufacture. What leaders actually do. Most conversations about leadership are, at bottom, conversations about power, about how to get it, how to exercise it, how to project it convincingly enough that others defer to it. The implicit model is vertical, the leader at the top, others arrayed below, authority flowing downward and results flowing up. This model is not entirely wrong. Positional authority is real. The person with the title can make certain things happen that the person without it cannot, but it is radically incomplete as an account of what actually creates the leadership outcomes that matter. Engaged, capable, motivated people who achieve things together that none of them could achieve alone. The most powerful leadership dynamic that exists is not hierarchical, it is relational. It is the quality of influence that flows from trust, not from title, from the genuine conviction held by the people being led that the person leading them understands them, cares about their success, has genuine competence in the domain they share, and is committed to a purpose that is worth pursuing. Leaders who have this kind of influence can achieve outcomes that positional authority cannot manufacture, because positional authority produces compliance, while this kind of influence produces commitment. And the difference between compliance and commitment is the difference between people doing what they are required to do and people doing what they are capable of doing. The research on transformational leadership, the framework developed by James McGregor Burns and subsequently elaborated by Bernard Bass, identifies 4 behaviors that consistently distinguish leaders who produce exceptional outcomes from those who produce average ones. None of these behaviors is about authority. All of them are about emotional intelligence. The first is idealized influence, the capacity to be genuinely worth following, not the performance of admirable qualities, but their actual embodiment. People watch leaders with extraordinary scrutiny. They notice the gap between what leaders say and what they do. They notice how leaders behave when the pressure is high and the stakes are real and the temptation to compromise is strongest. They notice whether the leader's expressed values are held consistently or selectively, honored when they are convenient, and set aside when they are costly. The leader who passes these tests, who demonstrates repeatedly and under genuine pressure that they actually mean what they say, acquires a quality of moral authority that positional authority cannot confer and cannot replace. Idealized influence requires, above all, the willingness to be honest about what you do not know. The leader who performs omniscience, who always has an answer, who cannot admit uncertainty, who never acknowledges error, does not inspire confidence in people who are paying close attention. They inspire anxiety, because people know that no one is omniscient, and a leader who pretends otherwise is operating with a distorted model of reality that will eventually produce expensive consequences. The leader who says, "I am not sure about this. Here is how I am thinking about it, and I want your perspective." That leader is modeling the intellectual honesty that high-performing teams require in order to function. They are demonstrating that it is safe to not know, to ask, to be wrong, and that demonstration changes what the people around them are willing to risk. The second behavior is inspirational motivation, the ability to help people see beyond the immediate task to a sense of purpose that makes the task worth doing. People can function perfectly well under purely transactional arrangements. They do the work, they receive the compensation, but they perform at the edge of their capability only when they care, when they have a genuine investment in the outcome that goes beyond the transaction. Creating that investment is one of the most important things a leader can do, and it cannot be done through announcements or presentations. It is done through conversations, specific, personal conversations, in which the leader helps each person understand how what they do connects to something that matters. The key word there is specific. Generic mission statements do not inspire people. Genuine understanding of the individual person and genuine connection between their specific contribution and the collective outcome that inspires people. The leader who knows what each person on their team cares about and who can help them see how their work serves those things is doing something that most leaders never attempt. They are not broadcasting inspiration. They are creating it individually in the only place it can actually take root, in the specific internal experience of a specific person. Intellectual stimulation is the third behavior, the consistent practice of inviting challenge, questioning assumptions, and creating an environment in which unconventional thinking is valued rather than merely tolerated. Most organizations have an enormous amount of latent intelligence that never gets deployed because the people who carry it do not believe it is safe to surface it. The idea that challenges the current approach, the question that implies the current strategy might be wrong, the observation that what everyone is assuming to be true might not be, these are genuinely valuable inputs. And in most organizations, they are suppressed through the ordinary operation of hierarchy, group dynamics, and the natural human desire to be liked and included. The leader who actively disrupts this suppression, who makes it genuinely clear through consistent behavior over time that the best thinking wins regardless of where it comes from, creates an environment of intellectual vitality that is one of the most significant competitive advantages available. This requires the leader to be genuinely comfortable being wrong in front of their people, to be visibly interested in challenges to their thinking rather than visibly threatened by them, to thank people for pushback rather than punishing them for it. These are simple behaviors. They are not common. Individualized consideration is the fourth behavior. treating each person as the specific human being they are rather than as a generic occupant of a role. Every person on a team has a different developmental stage, a different set of strengths, different ways of learning, different sources of motivation, different anxieties about their performance and their future. The leader who knows these things about the people they work with and who adjusts their approach accordingly is not playing favorites. They are applying the intelligence to vary their method while holding consistent standards. This requires time and genuine attention. It requires conversations that go beyond performance, reviews and project updates, conversations in which the leader is genuinely curious about what the person finds meaningful and difficult about their work, what they are trying to develop, what support they actually need. Most leaders do not have these conversations because they feel like a luxury when compared to the operational demands on their time. They are not a luxury. They are the investment that determines whether the people on the team are giving 80% of their capability or 100% of it. That difference, multiplied across a team over time, is not marginal. It is everything. Leadership, understood through the lens of emotional intelligence, is ultimately a practice of service. Not servility, not the abdication of authority or the avoidance of hard decisions, but genuine commitment to the success of the people you are leading, expressed through the consistent quality of your attention, your honesty, your adaptability, and your care. The leader who holds that commitment under pressure and over time creates something that cannot be mandated or manufactured. The willing, engaged, fully deployed contribution of human beings who believe that what they are doing together is worth doing, and that the person they are doing it with is worth following. That is what leaders actually do, not the performance of authority, the practice of trust, emotional intelligence and social mastery. Full audiobook script, Part 3 of 3 Wolves in Empathy's Clothing. There is a particular irony embedded in the development of emotional intelligence that most books in this space quietly avoid. The same skills that make you more perceptive, more empathetic, more attuned to the emotional undercurrents of human interaction. Those same skills make you a more attractive target for people who have learned to weaponize emotional language for their own benefit. Empathy, in the wrong relational context, is not just a strength, it is a vulnerability. And the person who develops emotional intelligence without also developing the ability to recognize and defend against emotional manipulation is building a house with excellent windows and no locks. This is not a reason to remain emotionally closed. The cost of emotional closure, the isolation, the missed connection, the diminished capacity for genuine intimacy and collaboration is too high. But it is a reason to understand, clearly and without sentimentality, the specific tactics that emotionally manipulative people use, so that when you encounter them, you can name what is happening rather than being confused and destabilized by it. The first and most important thing to understand about emotional manipulators is that they are not, in most cases, consciously evil. Many of them operate from patterns that were adaptive in earlier relational contexts, often in families where love was conditional, where emotional needs were met through control rather than genuine connection, where the experience of vulnerability was followed reliably by pain. The manipulation is, from the inside, often experienced as self-protection. This does not make it acceptable. But it is relevant to understanding why the patterns are so persistent and why the people who exhibit them are often genuinely shocked when confronted with the effect their behavior has on others. Guilt-based manipulation is perhaps the most common form, and it operates through one of the most reliable levers in human psychology, the discomfort of believing you have caused harm to someone you care about. Healthy expressions of hurt look like this. When you did that specific thing, I felt hurt. And here is what I need from you. Manipulative expressions look like this. After everything I have done for you, or if you really cared about me, or I guess I just do not matter to you. The difference is structural. Healthy emotional expression is specific, takes ownership of the feeling, and makes a clear request. Manipulative expression is vague, attributes the feeling to a global failure of your character or care, and has no resolution. because resolution is not the goal. The goal is the creation of an emotional debt that can be drawn upon to produce compliance. The person on the receiving end feels guilty without being clear about what they have actually done, and that guilt tends to generate concessions that are disproportionate to any actual wrong. The defense against guilt-based manipulation requires a specific kind of internal clarity. You need to be able to hold two things simultaneously: genuine openness to the possibility that you have done something genuinely hurtful, and firm resistance to accepting responsibility for the other person's emotional management. These are not in conflict. You can ask yourself honestly, did I actually do something that caused harm? If yes, acknowledge it and make genuine amends. If no, or if the claim is vague enough that you cannot evaluate it, you can acknowledge the other person's distress without accepting the framing that you caused it. I can hear that you are upset, and I care about that. I am not sure I understand exactly what I did that hurt you, and I would genuinely like to. That response is compassionate without being capitulating. Fear-based manipulation works differently. It operates by making you anxious about consequences, the withdrawal of love, the loss of a relationship, a professional consequence, social exclusion, in ways that compress your decision-making into a narrow window where careful evaluation is not possible. The signature of fear-based manipulation is urgency that is not justified by actual circumstances. You need to decide now. If you do not agree to this, things will change between us. Everyone else is already on board. The antidote to fear-based manipulation is time. Genuine urgency exists in the world. There are real deadlines, real windows, real moments when action is required before the opportunity passes. But genuine urgency comes with a clear, specific, verifiable reason for the time pressure. Manufactured urgency tends to dissolve under examination. When someone is pressing you to decide before you have had adequate time to think, the appropriate response is to slow down rather than speed up. I need more time to think about this. If that timeline is genuinely fixed, help me understand why. If the urgency cannot survive that question, it was probably not real. Gaslighting is perhaps the most psychologically damaging form of manipulation because it operates by attacking your perception of reality itself. The gaslighter consistently tells you that what you observed did not happen, that what you felt is not an appropriate response to the situation, that your memory of events is wrong, that your emotional reactions are evidence of instability rather than appropriate responses to real circumstances. Over time, the sustained assault on a person's confidence in their own perceptions can produce profound disorientation, a state in which the person is no longer sure what they actually experienced and has become dependent on the gaslighter's version of events to orient themselves. Recognizing gaslighting requires trusting your own perceptions, which is exactly what the pattern is designed to erode. Some practical anchors help. Keep a record, not in a paranoid way, but with enough specificity that when your memory is later challenged, you have something external to refer to. Seek outside perspective from people who know you well and whose judgment you trust. And pay attention to the consistency of the pattern. A single instance of someone remembering an event differently than you do is a difference of perspective. A sustained pattern in which your perceptions are consistently and systematically contradicted by the same person is something qualitatively different. Intermittent reinforcement is perhaps the subtlest of the manipulation patterns, and in some ways the most powerful, because it does not feel like manipulation from the inside. It feels like hope. The person who sometimes treats you with extraordinary warmth, generosity, and attentiveness, and at other times is cold, dismissive, or critical, without any clear pattern that would allow you to predict which version you will encounter, has created the psychological conditions for an extremely powerful attachment. The variability of the reward keeps the seeking behavior active in a way that consistent reward never would. The nervous system that never knows when the good will come is a nervous system that cannot stop looking for it. If you find yourself in a relationship, personal or professional, where you are constantly trying to figure out what you need to do to earn the positive version of the other person, where you feel relief rather than simple pleasure when they are kind, where the good moments feel like oxygen and the bad moments feel like withdrawal. Pay attention to that pattern. It is not chemistry, it is conditioning, and it does not improve over time. The most important protection against all forms of emotional manipulation is not suspicion. It is self-knowledge. When you know clearly what you actually think, what you actually feel, and what you actually value, when your sense of yourself is stable enough that it does not require external validation to maintain its shape, manipulation becomes significantly less effective. The tactics that work most reliably are the ones that exploit uncertainty about your own worth, your own perceptions, your own right to have needs and limits. Develop that certainty through the self-awareness practices we have discussed throughout this book, and you become substantially harder to destabilize. This is not about becoming invulnerable or closed. It is about becoming grounded. There is a meaningful difference between being guarded, protected by distance and suspicion, and being grounded, protected by a stable, accurate sense of your own reality. The guarded person is not available for genuine connection. The grounded person is fully available and also genuinely safe in ways the guarded person never is. The wolves are real, but they are far less dangerous to the person who can see them clearly. Reading the room at the molecular level. There is a version of social perception that most people operate with, a rough, impressionistic sense of the emotional atmosphere of a situation, the general mood of the person they are talking to, the overall temperature of a room. This version is functional. It is what most people use to navigate most of their social life, and it works well enough for interactions that do not require great precision or high-stakes navigation. And then there is what master practitioners of emotional intelligence do, a level of perceptual acuity that is qualitatively different, not just in degree, but in kind. They are reading multiple channels simultaneously. They are tracking micro shifts in state that occur in fractions of seconds. They are noticing the specific moment at which a conversation changes direction internally before it changes direction verbally. They are, in a meaningful sense, reading the room at the molecular level, attending to the smallest available signals and integrating them into an ongoing, continuously updated model of the emotional reality of the situation. This level of social perception is learnable, but it requires understanding what you are actually attending to and why the signals at this level are so much more informative than the more obvious ones. The most significant thing about subtle emotional signals is that they are, by definition, less consciously controlled than obvious ones. When someone knows they are being observed, they manage their presentation at the level of gross expression. They smile when they are supposed to smile, they perform interest, they modulate their voice toward whatever conveys the image they want to project. But at the level of micro-expression, of slight vocal fluctuation, of breathing pattern, of the micro movements of the hands when the person is unaware of being observed, at that level, the management is much more difficult. The signal that gets through at that level is much more likely to be honest. Vocal micro-shifts are one of the richest sources of this kind of information. The voice is extraordinarily expressive of internal state, and while people can manage their voice at the gross level, choosing a tone, modulating volume, controlling pace, the fine-grained qualities of vocal production are much harder to fully control. A slight increase in vocal tension that produces a thinning of the resonance. A micro-hesitation before a specific word that suggests the word required more processing than usual. A barely perceptible drop in vocal energy at the end of a statement that should, given its content, carry conviction. Each of these is a signal. Together, they constitute a kind of continuous emotional soundtrack running beneath the words. Developing sensitivity to vocal micro-shifts requires deliberate practice in listening that goes beyond content. Most people listen for the information being conveyed, the argument being made, the narrative being told. Advanced calibrators listen for for the quality of the voice behind the words, for the subtle variations in that quality as the content changes, for the moments of congruence and incongruence between what is being said and how it is being delivered. A practical way to develop this is to listen to recorded conversations, interviews, podcasts, recorded meetings, with your eyes closed, attending exclusively to the voice. Without the visual channel to process, the auditory channel becomes richer and more detailed. You will begin to notice things about voices that you never noticed before. The slight tightening that accompanies stress, the quality of ease. In a voice when the person is discussing something they know well and genuinely care about, the flatness that sometimes accompanies a statement that is being said from obligation rather than conviction. Breathing patterns are another channel that most people never consciously attend to, despite the fact that breathing is one of the most direct and least manipulable expressions of emotional state available. When people are relaxed and comfortable, breathing is slow, deep, and largely invisible. It does not draw attention to itself. Under anxiety, breathing becomes shallower and faster, often visible in the upper chest and shoulders rather than the abdomen. Under controlled stress, the state of someone who is managing a strong emotion rather than expressing it freely, breathing often becomes deliberately slowed, which produces a subtle quality of effortful steadiness rather than natural ease. You can often observe breathing changes in the shoulders and upper chest, even in people who are otherwise managing their presentation well. The person who takes a slightly too deliberate breath before responding to a question is almost certainly managing something. What they are managing may be perfectly innocent. They may simply be being careful, but it is worth noting. The pattern observed across multiple instances tends to become interpretable. Energy calibration is perhaps the most advanced of these skills, and the hardest to teach in abstract terms because it involves a form of perception that is more integrative than analytical. It is the sense of the overall quality of presence that a person or a room is generating, something that is experienced more as a felt sense than as a specific observation. Some people walk into a room and the energy of the room changes. Some people generate a quality of aliveness and engagement that is palpable before they have said anything. Others carry a heaviness, a contraction, a low-level anxiety that spreads to the people around them. Developing sensitivity to energy requires developing sensitivity to your own response. When you enter a room or approach a person, before you process anything consciously, pause for a moment and notice what is happening in your body. Do you feel slightly more expanded or slightly more contracted? Slightly more energized or slightly more depleted? Slightly more at ease or slightly more alert to threat? Your nervous system is processing information about the emotional environment faster than your conscious mind can, and these somatic signals are the readout of that processing. Learning to read them is learning to make conscious use of information your body has already received. One of the most practically valuable calibration skills is the detection of performed states, the recognition that what someone is displaying does not match what they are experiencing. The meeting where the apparent consensus is actually compliance, the enthusiasm that is hollow, the confidence that is covering uncertainty, the anger that is actually fear. These incongruences are everywhere once you learn to look for them, and recognizing them is not about exposing or confronting. It is about responding to reality rather than to performance. When you detect a performed state, the most useful response is almost never to name it directly, at least not immediately. Direct naming of an unexpressed emotional state tends to produce defensiveness, because it violates the implicit social contract by which the person chose not to express that state in the first place. The more effective response is to create conditions in which the authentic state can surface naturally, through a question that opens space, through a reduction in the social pressure that made the performance necessary, through a quality of genuine safety that makes the performance feel unnecessary. You might say, I want to make sure we have actually heard everyone's concerns before we move forward. Is there anything you have been holding back that would be useful for us to know? That question does not name what you have observed. It simply opens a door that the observed incongruence suggests needs opening, and more often than not, if the safety is genuine, someone will walk through it. The practice of reading at this level is, ultimately, a practice of radical attention, of bringing the full quality of your perceptual and empathic intelligence to bear on what is actually happening in the human beings in front of you, rather than on what is supposed to be happening, or what you would prefer to be happening, or what the surface of the interaction suggests is happening. It is attending to the full signal, rather than the edited version. And what you find when you do this is that most people are carrying considerably more than they are saying. More uncertainty, more feeling, more complexity, more of the full texture of human experience than the social surface of most interactions ever accommodates. When you can see that complexity and respond to it, not by exposing it, but by honoring it through the quality of your attention, you become the rarest and most valuable kind of person in most people's experience. Someone who actually sees what is there, the contagion you choose to spread. In 2008, the social scientists Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler published research that demonstrated something remarkable about the spread of human emotional states through social networks. Using data from the Framingham Heart Study, a longitudinal study that had been tracking the health of a large community for decades, they showed that happiness, loneliness, and a range of emotional states spread through social networks, not just to people you know directly, but to friends of friends, and even to friends of friends of friends. The emotional climate you generate ripples outward through your social network in ways that extend well beyond your direct relationships. This finding has implications that are at once humbling and empowering. Humbling because it means that the emotional states you generate and sustain are not contained within your own experience or even within your immediate relationships. They propagate. They affect people you may never meet through the chain of emotional influence that connects all of us. Empowering because it means that the work of developing emotional intelligence, of becoming someone who generates states of calm, engagement, genuine positivity, and authentic connection, is not just personal development. It is a form of social contribution. Every person who does this work makes the networks they inhabit slightly warmer, slightly more safe, slightly more alive. The mechanism behind emotional contagion operates through mirror neurons, through the vocal and facial mimicry that happens automatically and below conscious awareness when human beings interact, and through the complex feedback loops between internal emotional states and external, physiological expression. When you spend time with someone who is genuinely enthusiastic, your mirror neuron system begins to generate representations of that enthusiasm in your own brain. When you are around someone who is genuinely calm under pressure, something in your nervous system begins to settle. These are not metaphors, they are biological processes. This means that the emotional state you carry into an interaction is not just your internal business. It is part of what you give to the other person. It is, in a literal sense, contagious. And the quality of that contagion, whether it raises or lowers the energy available for connection, creativity, and effective action, is something you have significant influence over. But there is a crucial distinction that the research on emotional contagion consistently surfaces. Authentic emotional states are contagious in ways that performed emotional states are not. When someone is genuinely enthusiastic, the enthusiasm spreads. When someone is performing enthusiasm, generating the surface expressions of it while the underlying state is flat or anxious or disengaged, people feel the incongruence, often without being able to name it. The performance does not spread. In some cases, the gap between the performed state and the underlying one generates its own kind of contagion, a low-level unease, a vague sense that something is not quite right, that the interaction is not fully real. This is why emotional leadership cannot be built on performance. It has to be built on the actual development of the emotional states that serve the people and situations around you, which means that the most important work in this domain is not about learning to project positivity. It is about developing the genuine capacity for regulated, engaged, purposeful emotional experience so that what you are expressing is actually what you are feeling, and what you are feeling is actually something that serves the moment. Generating authentic positive states in difficult circumstances is not the same as pretending that difficult circumstances are not difficult. It is the practice of finding, within difficult circumstances, the genuine sources of meaning, connection, or even challenge that are actually there. The meeting that feels draining can also be understood as an opportunity to develop the skill of maintaining presence under conditions that test it. The conflict that feels threatening can also be held as an opportunity to practice the kind of courage that builds trust. The uncertainty that feels destabilizing can also be approached with the genuine curiosity that makes uncertainty interesting rather than merely frightening. These reframes are not denial. They are the practice of maintaining access to a broader range of the emotional possibilities available in any given situation, rather than collapsing into the narrowest and most threat-focused interpretation. And when that practice is genuine, when the broader frame is actually held rather than just stated, the emotional state that emerges from it is real. It spreads. It changes what is possible in the room. The specific emotional states most worth cultivating and spreading are, not coincidentally, the ones that research on positive psychology and organizational behavior most consistently associates with high performance and genuine well-being. Curiosity, genuine interest in the world and the people in it, tends to open rather than close, to generate rather than deplete, to create the conditions for learning and connection rather than for defensiveness and contraction. Warmth, the genuine felt experience of positive regard for the people around you, tends to generate trust, safety, and the willingness to contribute fully. Equanimity, the capacity to remain stable and open under conditions that generate stress or difficulty, tends to provide the psychological safety that allows the people around you to think clearly, take risks, and be honest. These states are not performed. They are cultivated through practice, through the repeated choice to orient toward them even when easier states are available, until the orientation becomes habitual and the states become genuinely accessible rather than aspirationally distant. Energy management is what makes sustained emotional leadership possible. The capacity to consistently generate these states requires that the system generating them be adequately maintained. Sleep, movement, nutrition, time in relationships that restore rather than deplete, work that engages rather than numbs. These are not lifestyle preferences. They are the infrastructure of emotional vitality. The person who consistently neglects this infrastructure eventually finds that the states they are trying to generate are simply not available. They are running the emotional equivalent of a device with a depleted battery, capable of output in theory, not in practice. There is a final dimension too, emotional contagion, that is worth dwelling on, because it is the one most often overlooked in conversations about emotional influence. The states you choose to spread are not just about their immediate effect on the people around you. They are the conditions under which you do your thinking, your relating, your contributing. The emotional environment you generate is the environment you inhabit. The warmth you extend is warmth you experience. The curiosity you bring is curiosity that enriches your own engagement with the world. The equanimity you cultivate is equanimity that makes your own experience of difficulty more navigable. Emotional leadership is not a gift you give to others while paying a personal cost. Done well, it is a practice that elevates the quality of your own experience at the same time that it elevates the quality of the experience of the people around you. The contagion you choose to spread comes back to you. Choose it wisely. Choose it generously. Choose it as something worth spreading because you have found it genuinely worth inhabiting. Unbreakable. The word resilience has been used so broadly and so casually in the self-help literature that it has come to mean almost nothing specific, just a general quality of bouncing back, of not staying down, of persisting despite difficulty. This vagueness is a problem, because resilience is actually a very specific set of capacities, and people who develop it do so through very specific practices. When we do not know what we are actually building, we cannot build it deliberately. What resilience actually is, in the technical sense that the research supports, is a dynamic process rather than a fixed trait. It is not something you have in a stable quantity that determines how well you will handle adversity. It is something that is constructed in real time through the interaction between the challenge you are facing and the resources, internal and external, that you bring to bear on it. This means that resilience is always situational. A person who is highly resilient under one kind of adversity may struggle under another because the specific resources required are different. And it means that resilience can be developed, not by simply enduring more hardship, but by deliberately building the specific capacities that research has identified as its active components. The first component is what the research calls explanatory style, the habitual way you account for the causes of negative events. The psychologist Martin Seligman's work on learned helplessness and its opposite identified 3 dimensions along which explanatory styles vary, and showed that these dimensions have significant consequences for how well people cope with adversity and how quickly they recover from it. The first dimension is permanence, whether you attribute the cause of a negative event to something permanent or temporary. The person who explains a setback as "this is just how things are for me" is making a permanent attribution. The person who explains it as "this is a difficult period that I am moving through" is making a temporary one. The second dimension is pervasiveness, whether the cause is something that affects all areas of your life or is specific to one domain. The person who explains a professional failure by concluding that they are fundamentally inadequate is making a pervasive attribution. The person who concludes that they handled this particular situation poorly is making a specific one. The third dimension is personalization, whether the cause is internal to you or external. Neither extreme is healthy. The person who attributes everything to themselves and the person who attributes everything to external circumstances are both distorting reality. The resilient explanatory style is one that is balanced, that takes appropriate personal responsibility without defaulting to global self-condemnation. Developing a more resilient explanatory style is not about positive thinking in the shallow sense. It is about accuracy. The permanently, pervasively self-blaming explanatory style is almost always less accurate than the temporary, specific, balanced one, because most negative events have multiple causes. Most failures are specific, rather than indicative of global inadequacy, and most difficult periods do pass. The practice is to notice when you are making inaccurate, permanent, or pervasive attributions, and to actively challenge them. What is the most accurate account of what happened here? Is this really a reflection of who I am fundamentally, or is it a reflection of how I handled a specific situation under specific circumstances? Are these circumstances permanent, or are they temporary? The second component is cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold multiple interpretations of a situation simultaneously and to move between them fluidly rather than being locked into a single framing. Rigid cognitive styles, the tendency to interpret events in a consistent, narrow way that does not update in response to new information, are one of the most reliable predictors of poor resilience. The person who can only see a setback as evidence of failure cannot also see it as information, as an opportunity, as a stage in a process that is not yet complete. And the inability to see it as anything other than failure determines that it will function as one. Developing cognitive flexibility requires something that is both simple and genuinely difficult: the practice of deliberately generating alternative interpretations of situations that trigger strong negative emotional responses, not to replace the first interpretation necessarily, but to ensure that it is not the only one available. The question to ask is not whether your first interpretation is wrong. It may not be. The question is whether it is the only possible interpretation, or the most complete one, or the one that best serves your ability to respond effectively to the situation. And the answer to that question, when you actually ask it, is almost always no. The third component is what Nassim Taleb called anti-fragility, The capacity not just to recover from adversity, but to be strengthened by it. Fragile systems break under stress. Robust systems survive it unchanged. Anti-fragile systems emerge from it with increased capacity. The human organism, under the right conditions, is anti-fragile. The immune system is strengthened by exposure to challenge. Muscle grows in response to the stress of resistance training. The nervous system becomes more regulated through the practice of managing activation. The emotional intelligence you are developing throughout this book is itself anti-fragile. It grows specifically through exposure to the challenging situations that test it. Developing the anti-fragile orientation means approaching difficulty with a specific question. What will this build in me? Not as a performance of positivity, but as a genuine inquiry. What capabilities am I developing right now that I did not have before? What is this experience teaching me about myself, about people, about what actually matters? What will I be able to handle because of having handled this that I could not have handled before? These questions do not make the difficulty disappear. They change its meaning. And meaning, as Frankl demonstrated in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, is one of the most powerful resources available to the human organism under adversity. The fourth component is connection, the maintenance and active use of relationships that provide genuine support during difficult periods. This is the component most often sacrificed to the social mythology of the self-sufficient individual. The person who handles their own problems without burdening others, who does not need help and would not ask for it even if they did. That mythology is expensive. The research on social support and resilience is unambiguous. People who maintain strong social connections during adversity recover faster, experience less physiological damage from stress, and generate more creative solutions to the problems they are facing than people who face the same adversity in isolation. The capacity to ask for help when you need it is not weakness. It is one of the most important social competencies available, and it is, for many people, one of the most underdeveloped. It requires the willingness to be known in your difficulty, to allow someone else to see you in a state of genuine struggle rather than only in the states you have chosen to present. That vulnerability is precisely what makes the support possible. The support available to the performed self is superficial because the person offering it does not know what is actually needed. The support available to the genuine self is real because the person offering it has been given the actual information required to provide it. Equanimity is the thread that runs through all of these components, not as a goal, not as a performance, but as the gradually accumulating consequence of practicing all of them over time. Equanimity is not the absence of feeling, it is the capacity to have feelings, fully, honestly, without suppression or exaggeration, without being controlled by them. It is the ability to sit with uncertainty, without collapsing into either false certainty or paralysis. It is the quality of being moved, without being swept away. The Stoic philosophers, who devoted more sustained attention to the development of equanimity than perhaps any other tradition, understood it not as detachment from life, but as the fullest possible engagement with it. They practiced, daily, the contemplation of difficulty, not to dwell in misfortune, but to become familiar with it, to reduce its power to surprise and destabilize, to develop the internal capacity to meet it with steadiness when it actually arrived. Their insight was that the pain of adversity and the suffering of adversity are not the same thing. The pain is often unavoidable. The suffering, the story about the pain, the meaning assigned to it, the resistance to its presence, is often a choice. You will face things in your life that genuinely hurt. That is not a prediction. It is a certainty. What is not certain is the quality of the inner resources you will bring to those moments, whether you will face them having cultivated the self-awareness, the regulatory capacity, the cognitive flexibility, the relational support, and the sense of purpose that make difficulty navigable, or whether you will face them without those resources and find the difficulty correspondingly harder than it needed to be. Resilience is built in the ordinary moments, through the ordinary practices, long before the extraordinary moments arrive. It is built through the daily practice of self-awareness and regulation, through the consistent choice to approach difficulty with curiosity rather than avoidance, through the maintenance of relationships that are genuine and deep enough to provide real support, through the cultivation of meaning that is sturdy enough to survive real setbacks. Unbreakable does not mean you will not break. It means you will not stay broken. It means you will know from experience that you can handle more than you thought you could. And that knowledge, accumulated through the living of a life approached with genuine emotional intelligence, is one of the most durable forms of confidence available to a human being. The 90-day self. We have covered a great deal of ground together, from the invisible tax of emotional blindness to the architecture of the 5 pillars, from the molecular signals that reveal what people are actually feeling to the physiological mechanisms of self-regulation, from the ethics of influence to the psychology of manipulation, from the conversations we avoid to the leadership we could provide, from the resilience that is built in ordinary moments to the emotional contagion we choose to spread. All of it is useful. None of it matters unless it is applied. Knowledge without application is a particularly insidious form of comfort. It allows you to feel like you are making progress when you are actually just consuming. Reading about emotional intelligence, as important as it is, does not develop emotional intelligence. It develops your conceptual understanding of emotional intelligence, which is the beginning of the path, not the destination. The development happens in the actual moments of your actual life, in the meeting that goes sideways, in the conversation that becomes more difficult than you expected, in the relationship that is asking something of you that you are not sure you know how to give. That is where the work is done. Not in the consumption of frameworks, but in the application of them, with all the imperfection and discomfort that real application involves. The 90-day plan I am about to give you is not a curriculum, in the academic sense. It is a structured series of real-world experiments, specific practices to apply in specific kinds of situations, with specific reflection practices that allow you to extract learning from the application and use that learning to improve the next iteration. The goal is not to complete the plan. It is to use the plan to build the neural pathways, the habits of attention, and the accumulated experience of successful navigation that gradually transform these skills from things you know about into things you actually do. The first 30 days are dedicated entirely to the foundation, self-awareness and self-regulation, nothing else. Not because the other skills are less important, but because without this foundation, the other skills are houses built on sand. You cannot regulate effectively what you are not aware of. You cannot empathize accurately when you are in the grip of an unrecognized emotional reaction. You cannot influence ethically when your own emotional states are driving your behavior below the level of consciousness. In the first 10 days, your single practice is the emotional check-in. Set 3 alarms, morning, midday, afternoon, and when each one goes off, spend 60 seconds with these questions. What am I feeling right now, and where do I feel it in my body? What is my energy level? What is the quality of my attention, focused and present, or scattered and somewhere else? Write down what you find briefly in a phone note or a small notebook. Do not analyze it, just notice it. The practice at this stage is simply developing the habit of turning attention inward. In days 11 through 20, you add the trigger journal. Alongside the regular check-ins, you begin noting every time you have a strong emotional reaction, anytime you feel a significant pull toward defensiveness, anger, anxiety, withdrawal, or impulsive action. For each instance, record what happened immediately before the reaction, who was involved, what you were thinking about the situation in the moment, and what you did or wanted to do. Over 10 days, you will begin to see patterns. Specific people who reliably activate specific states. Specific kinds of situations that consistently trigger specific reactions. Specific thoughts that reliably accompany your strongest emotional responses. These patterns are the map of your emotional interior, the terrain you need to know in order to navigate it skillfully. In days 21 through 30, you introduce the pause. Every time you notice the early signals of emotional activation, the tension, the quickening, the pull toward reaction, you practice the stop sequence. Stop, take a breath, observe, proceed. You will not always catch it in time. That is fine. The goal in this phase is not perfection. It is developing the habit of attempting the pause, because the habit of attempting it gradually becomes the habit of achieving it. Even partial pauses, even moments where you notice you are activated and consciously choose to wait 30 seconds before responding, are building the neural circuitry that eventually makes regulation automatic. The second 30 days expand your focus outward to the perception and empathy skills that allow you to read and respond to others accurately. In days 31 through 40, you practice the expanded awareness technique in every significant conversation. Before you respond to what someone is saying, spend 1 second expanding your perceptual field to include their entire face, their posture, their vocal quality. You are not analyzing, you are receiving. Notice what is there. At this stage, simply developing the habit of attending to more than the words is the entire goal. In days 41 through 50, you practice empathic responding. In at least 2 conversations per day, before you offer a solution, a perspective, or a counter-argument, you first reflect back what you sense about the other person's emotional state. Not diagnostically, and not you seem frustrated in a clinical tone, but naturally. It sounds like this has been really difficult. I can hear how much this matters to you. I imagine this has been stressful. The person will either confirm or correct your reflection. Either outcome is useful. Confirmation tells you your perception was accurate. Correction tells you where your interpretation diverged from reality, and that divergence is information about your own assumptions and biases that you would not otherwise have access to. In days 51 through 60, you introduce one intentional practice from the influence framework in each significant professional interaction, not as a manipulation, but as a conscious experiment in applying what you understand about human psychology to create better outcomes for everyone involved. Start with reciprocity. Look for genuine ways to add value before asking for anything. Then try social proof. Share relevant examples of people your audience can identify with who have found a particular approach useful. Observe what happens. Adjust based on what you learn. The third 30 days are about integration and expansion, taking what you have built in the first 60 days and applying it in the most challenging domains, difficult conversations, leadership situations, high-stakes relationships, and the maintenance of your own emotional resilience. In days 61 through 70, you identify one conversation you have been avoiding, one real conversation with a real person about a real issue that has been sitting unaddressed. You use the framework from the chapter on difficult conversations. You prepare properly. You manage your emotional state before you begin. You open with acknowledgement before concern. You listen more than you speak. You close with specific commitments. And then you reflect on what happened honestly, extracting what worked and what you would do differently. In days 71 through 80, you practice emotional leadership in group settings. In each meeting or group interaction, you take on the practice of consciously attending to the group's emotional state and asking yourself, what does this room need right now? Sometimes it needs energy. Sometimes it needs calm. Sometimes it needs space for a concern that has not yet been voiced. Choose one thing to do in each group setting that is responsive to what you actually observe, rather than what you had planned to bring. Notice the effect. In days 81 through 90, you build your resilience infrastructure. Identify 3 practices that reliably restore your emotional and physiological capacity after periods of depletion. Not the things you think should restore you, the things that actually do. Schedule them into your week the way you schedule meetings because they are at least as important. Identify 2 relationships that provide genuine support. People who know you well enough to be honest with you, who care about your actual well-being rather than your performance. Invest in those relationships explicitly, not because they are transactional, but because they are among the most important assets you have. Throughout all 90 days, 3 daily practices anchor everything else. In the morning, spend 5 minutes with the question, what is my intention for today emotionally? Not what do I want to accomplish, but how do I want to show up? What quality of presence do I want to bring? What emotional state do I want to generate and maintain? Setting this intention does not guarantee it, but people who set it are significantly more likely to return to it when they drift, and drifting and returning is the actual practice. In the evening, spend 5 minutes with the question, what did I notice today? What emotional moments were most significant? Where did I manage well? Where did I fall short of what I intended? What would I do differently? This reflection is where the learning is consolidated, where the experience of the day is processed into understanding that informs the next day's practice. Once a week, review your trigger journal. Look for patterns that are becoming clearer. Look for progress, moments where you caught something that would have caught you before. Look for the persistent blind spots, the places where the same pattern keeps appearing without yet shifting. Those persistent blind spots are the edges of your current development, the places where the next phase of growth is available if you are willing to stay with them. 100 days from today, if you have practiced consistently, not perfectly but consistently, you will not be the same person you are right now in the domains that matter most. Your self-awareness will be measurably sharper. Your regulation will be more reliable. Your perception of others will be more accurate. Your influence will be more ethical and more effective. Your difficult conversations will be more productive. Your leadership will be more genuine. Your resilience will be deeper. Not because you have consumed the right content, because you have done the actual work. The room you walk into now. We began in a conference room. 31 years old, 7 people, 3 of them holding a decision that mattered, and a narrator who was smart, prepared, and fundamentally absent, present in body and argument, absent in the quality of attention that actually connects one human being to another. I want to go back to that room one more time, not to revisit the failure, but to inhabit it with everything we have built since. The version of me who walks into that room now walks in differently, not more confident in the performed sense, not with better posture and a more commanding voice, differently in the quality of his attention. He enters and immediately, without effort, begins receiving the room, the way the 3 decision-makers have arranged themselves, the slight tension between 2 of them that suggests something unresolved that predates this meeting. The energy level, not low, but careful, as if people are managing something they have not yet named. He sets up, he opens, and around the 12-minute mark, he notices it. The same shift I described at the beginning of this book, the lean back, the eyes going somewhere else. He notices it not as a judgment, not as an alarm, but as information. Something has changed. The room needs something different than what it has been. Getting. He stops. Not dramatically. He simply pauses, lets the silence have a moment, and asks a question he genuinely does not know the answer to. What concerns do you have about this that we have not addressed yet? The room shifts. Someone who has not spoken says something that turns out to be the actual center of gravity of the entire discussion, a concern that the whole meeting had been circling without landing on. The conversation changes, not from presentation to persuasion, but from monologue to dialogue, and the outcome, whatever it turns out to be, emerges from a genuine exchange between human beings, rather than from a performance delivered to an audience. That question, what concerns do you have that we have not addressed, is not a technique. It is a reflection of a way of being in rooms and relationships that everything in this book has been building toward. It is the question of someone who is genuinely curious about other people's experience, who has enough self-awareness to notice when their own approach is not serving the moment, who is regulated enough to pause rather than push, who is empathic enough to care about what the room actually needs rather than what they want to deliver, who is secure enough to not need the meeting to validate them, to be genuinely interested in a good outcome rather than a good performance. That is emotional intelligence, not a collection of techniques, not a set of skills deployed strategically, a way of moving through the world in which other people's inner lives are as real and as interesting to you as your own, in which the human being in front of you is always more important than the impression you are trying to make on them. This is what was missing in that room at 31. Not preparation, not intelligence, not even courage, exactly. Presence, the quality of attention that makes genuine contact possible. The willingness to be actually here, actually curious, actually responsive to what is, actually happening, rather than to the version of events you arrived with. Everything in this book, every framework, every practice, every skill, is in service of that quality of presence. It is what the 5 pillars build toward. It is what self-regulation makes possible by clearing the noise of emotional reactivity. It is what empathy delivers when it is genuine rather than performed. It is what psychological safety requires in its creator before it can exist for anyone else. It is what resilience protects, not the performance of strength, but the authentic capacity to remain present through difficulty without shutting down or shutting out. The room you walk into next week will have people in it who are carrying more than they are saying, who are trying to solve problems that are more complex than they look from the outside, who are hoping, often without knowing they are hoping, to be genuinely understood by someone who is actually paying attention. You can be that person now. Not perfectly, not in every moment, but increasingly, and with increasing depth, as the practices you have begun to develop continue to compound. The invisible tax has been running long enough. What you have built here is the beginning of the refund. Every room you walk into from this point forward, you walk in more whole.